and welcome to Travels Through Time. In each episode of this podcast, we invite a special guest to take us on a tailored tour of the past. Travels Through Time is brought to you in partnership with History Today, Britain's best-loved serious history magazine. You can read articles relating to this podcast and more about our guests at historytoday.com/travels. There is also a special subscription offer for Travels Through Time listeners. 3 issues for just £1 each. Hello, I'm Peter Moore. Today I'm talking to the classicist Armand D'Angour. Together we'll be travelling to the 5th century BC, to the golden age of ancient Athens. And most importantly of all, we're going to see the philosopher Socrates. Socrates is commonly called the founder of Western philosophy. He's known above all for his curiosity. As an old man, we're told that he used to stroll about the marketplaces of Athens, asking everyone he met searching questions about the nature of life. This was his way of discovering truth, and it was something new. Before Socrates, philosophy had been obsessed with lofty metaphysical questions. But as Cicero said, Socrates brought philosophy out of the heavens and he made it reside on the earth. Many people also remember the manner of his death. He infamously killed himself by drinking a draught of hemlock in 399 BC. But what else can be said about Socrates' life? We're about to find out from our guest, Armand D'Angour. He's an associate professor of the classics at Oxford University, where he's a tutor and a fellow at Jesus College. He's recently finished a book called Socrates in Love, in which he assembles a biography of the man that he calls philosophy's first and greatest hero. In it, we meet Socrates as the son of a stonemason, as a soldier in battle, and as a political insider. Armand also unveils a fascinating and hitherto underappreciated influence on the young philosopher, and that's a politically powerful woman called Aspasia. This is all very new and exciting scholarship. I met Armand at his home in London a few weeks ago, and as ever I limited him to 3 scenes in the past. Usually we confine our time travellers to a single year as well, but because it's difficult to be precise with the chronology of the ancient world, I allowed him a little more scope than usual. He decided to travel to the years 450 to 415 BC, and as ever, I began by asking him what it was that attracted him towards this time.
Athens, in the course of that century, the 5th century BC, became something of a cultural hub as well as an empire. It wielded its power over hundreds of the other Greek states, some of which were in mainland Greece, others on the islands, others in Asia Minor, modern Turkey, and so on. So Athens was a particularly powerful city during its heyday, which is about the period I've chosen, and the beginnings of philosophy, rhetoric, and all kinds of poetry that had been going on for centuries, drawing its inspiration mainly from the great epics of Homer. So one of the dates that I've chosen is 450 BC in Athens. And the reason I've chosen that is I think that was a very significant date for Socrates' early youth. So he would have been just 19. And on that day, a man called Alcibiades the Elder will have returned from exile and returned with his wife and with his wife's sister, whose name was Aspasia.
And Aspasia becomes a big presence, we think, in Socrates' early life. This is what we think might have happened.
Well, this is what I think might have happened.
Well, exactly what you think might have happened. And you describe her as one of the most striking, eloquent and controversial women of her age. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Aspasia?
She was the wife, in effect. We don't know whether she actually had a formal marriage, but she became the close, intimate partner of Pericles until his death in 429. And, of course, people said she was the power behind the throne. Whenever Athens went to war, she was the one who had instigated it.
So she's almost an archetype for a very familiar character that we have in history and in literature. Is she well documented in classical literature?
No, she's not. They basically wrote her off as a prostitute, a harlot, and a brothel keeper.
Okay, so not massively endearing to history.
Well, but what is fascinating is that the philosophical biographers of Socrates, Plato, and Xenophon mention Aspasia, and where they do so, they say nothing of the kind.
Okay.
They say she was a respected teacher. There's a whole dialogue with Plato called the Menexenus, in which Aspasia is portrayed as teaching Socrates how to give a funeral speech.
Okay. So in 450 BC, where we are now, she's just arrived.
She's just arrived.
And is this the point when she meets Socrates?
We are told that at the age of 17, Socrates went to the island of Samos with a philosopher called Archelaus. So here we have two, let's say, 20-year-olds in 450 BC, perhaps meeting for the first time. And we are told by a source that Socrates and his friends used to visit Aspasia to hear her talk about love. And that has been dismissed.
So this is new, and this is interesting on all sorts of different fronts, because it's an early influence on Socrates, of course, but it's this entry of a very distinguished and intellectually powerful woman into the Socrates story very, very early on.
Yes. What do we know about pre-Socratic philosophy? It was about things like, how does the world begin? What is it made of? Is it made of water or fire or air? This is the so-called physical philosophy of the Ionian school. And suddenly we find in the world of Socratic philosophy, what is the good life? How are we to live? What is justice? What is truth? What is knowledge? What is love? So he humanizes the questions that philosophers ask. So what makes the switch? If you're going to be a philosopher, so as I said, his early influence or his early pupillage was with a philosopher called Archelaus. We look at Archelaus' philosophy. It's nothing to do with how should we live, but it's much more to do with these rather high-flown ideas of cosmology. So what made him change? Now, we have a little bit of evidence in Plato's dialogue Phaedo. I used to be interested in all that scientific stuff. How does the brain work and how do we investigate physical things? But he said, I realised that there were no answers to that. And it didn't give me the answers I wanted, he says.
And you've found this wonderful interchange, haven't you, between Aspasia and Socrates, which I'll let you talk about now, because it brings them together.
It brings them together, but nobody tells us that in the ancient sources. So what I have done in the book is I discovered what I think is a new and incredibly revolutionary piece of evidence. There are only 2 dialogues of Plato out of around 30 that are attributed to him, but out of those, only 2 of them in which a woman is portrayed as instructing Socrates. The Menexenus, which I've already mentioned, is the one in which she is instructing him on eloquence and teaching him how to give a funeral speech. And the other, called the Symposium, it's a group of men talking about love, and Socrates gives a speech in which he says, I will tell you the truth about love as I learned it from a woman. Her name was Diotima. Now, Diotima, the name, doesn't appear to be known in any other context. We have no biographical information about her from any other booklet or any source. And so people have said, well, she's a kind of fiction. Because if it is true that Socrates said, I learned all these things from Diotima, those things that he learned are actually central to what he goes on to say his philosophy is about. So the ideas of love, but also the broader concepts that Diotima introduces in the Symposium, according to Socrates in that dialogue, are terribly important for later Socratic philosophy. So people have said, well, Diotima didn't really exist. She's a kind of Platonic fiction. And the moment you say the words 440 BC to an ancient historian, you immediately know what the most important thing that happened in that year was. It was the invasion of the island of Samos by Pericles, allegedly at the instigation of Aspasia. Once the identification is made, you bring in the independent evidence for Aspasia holding salons, discoursing about love, and you have quite a detailed description. The identification becomes more secure, I think. The key is when you realize that the name Diotima holds a very strong clue, because it means in Greek honored by Zeus. Honored by Zeus, I mean, in a way, the minimal claim I would make is that anybody reading Plato's Symposium and recognizing that actually it is set up in a very dramatic fashion. My minimal claim is they would have recognized that honoured by Zeus means honoured by Pericles. And no other woman was honoured by an Athenian as much as Aspasia was honoured by Pericles. People have dismissed the Menexenus. This is a dialogue written by the philosopher Plato, dismissed it as a joke.
Really?
They have taken what the comic playwrights say, comedians, as serious. And the comedians say she was a prostitute and a brothel keeper who instigated the Peloponnesian War because 2 of her whores were stolen by the Megarians. It is extraordinary that people will take that seriously and historical, and therefore say she must have been a prostitute, and not take what Plato and Xenophon say, this kind of respected teacher of Socrates, seriously. What is also fascinating in the history of scholarship is that for the last couple of 100 years, scholars were a bit hesitant to say she was a common whore, which is, of course, what the comic playwrights say, and a brothel keeper. How could she have been married to the leader of Athens or his partner for 16 years, from, say, 445 to 429, if she was a prostitute and a brothel keeper? It doesn't make sense at all. So what they've done is they've called her a courtesan, which is this higher version.
And I'm wondering if this, in a way, you're talking about the ebb and flow of history and how people's reputations change through time. But maybe at the moment when there is a greater interest in women's stories in history, it's easier for us to admit or to even take seriously the premise that here she is with intellectual authority over him. They're in close physical contact, the 2 of them together, but she is really guiding Socrates. And this is an important point you're making, because from the very beginning you said that we have this, this picture of Socrates as the old wise man, but we don't really know how he got there. And this is maybe a bit of a key in that puzzle of how he got there, because often people have a mentor, and it seems that she is playing that role towards him in the years after 450 BC when she arrives in Athens. Is that what you're contending?
That's exactly what I think. And I also think that one doesn't produce philosophical ideas from a vacuum. It's part of your personal experience of life. Socrates says, "But I love you." She says, "What is love?" She says, love isn't just about sexual attraction. It's not about 2 people getting together. It's about much higher things than that. That is key to Socrates' later philosophy. Love and other things.
But I think that the picture of them, and this is probably where we'd be on our time travels, is somewhere, around 450 BC, yes. Seeing not just Aspasia, but also the young Socrates, which is a wonderful picture himself. We know, I think you note that he's the son of a stonemason, is that right?
Right.
He's athletic, he's going to be a warrior.
Yep. Well educated, he's going to be a hoplite soldier, which means that he will have to have a full panoply, which means he comes from a relatively wealthy background.
Yeah, this is radically different to the picture of Socrates that we carry around in our heads.
Because the later Socrates decided he wasn't interested in money, he went around barefoot and in rags, and he decided to devote his life to thinking. He would have had a mass of curly hair. He would have been incredibly fit. Yes, he was the son of a stonemason. He's a man who can lug about hundreds of pounds worth of heavy marble and do chipping and so on. So he's fit, he's physically strong, and he's brilliant. He's thinking all the time, and he meets Aspasia, and something happens.
And there we have, as you describe it, if only for a short while, an appealing image of Socrates in love. Let's leave that, because I think that's a wonderful scene, the 2 of them there in this intellectual but charged atmosphere, and move on to our second one. Where are we going to go now from there?
So the other main influence that we are told that turned Socrates into a philosopher was his visit to the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. So
that's where we are now.
So we're going out of Athens.
Give us a bit of a geographical appreciation of where are we?
Right, so if you head up north into Delphi, it's a mountainous area. There at the top of one of the mountainous regions is the city of Delphi. It's a beautiful site even today. And visitors from all over the Greek world, Greeks and non-Greeks, would visit the Temple of Apollo because there sat the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, who was said to have been inspired by the god to give prophecies in a raving fashion.
Okay, and in 445, we find Socrates there. Is he there on his own or is he with someone else?
Right. Well, again, in Plato's report, my friend Chaerephon went to Delphi, says Socrates in his defense speech, and he asked, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? Of course, a bit of a leading question. And the answer came back, no. And Socrates says, I was amazed by this, and I thought, the god Apollo can't be wrong. I'm going to test this by going and asking people what they know about truth and beauty and justice and so on. And he said, I kept asking people who had a reputation for wisdom, and I realized they thought they knew, but they didn't. He said, so then I realized that what the god must mean is I'm only wiser because I don't know the answer, but at least I know that I don't know. So this is this great Socratic denial of knowledge. I know that I don't know, which of course a lot of people don't. And he felt then it was his mission to teach us that we can't assume we have knowledge. We have to question everything we think we know. He wants to say...
It's quite an inflammatory thing to have said about you as well, because
Indeed,
it kind of puts
is.
a bit of a mark on your back as someone who's elevating themselves.
Yeah, and in the defence speech, you get Socrates saying, please don't interrupt.
Okay.
So you obviously imagine these 500 jurors going, don't tell us about that. And he say, look, Chaerephon went there, and he came back, and he said that this was the answer of the oracle. So yes, it's an inflammatory thing to say, and it perhaps is less inflammatory to say that someone else did it on my behalf than to say, I went along and I heard that I was...
So we have this picture of Socrates almost as a man apart. And intellectually as well, it's suggested, it's implicit in the fact that someone has gone to Delphi to ask this question, that he's already standing above his peers in terms of intellectual ability. People don't just go and ask these questions for no reason.
That's exactly right. If one reads the dialogues of Plato, in which Socrates is the main character, you realise this is a very clever man. Someone who can present, for example, in Plato's dialogue Meno, the Pythagorean theorem with tremendous clarity. It's a beautiful demonstration. So this is a clever man. This is an educated man. It's an intellectually curious man. I would think that, as you say, the ideas that Socrates starts to develop philosophically are already there. By the time he goes to Delphi, he's already thinking in philosophical terms. What he's thinking of is a philosophy which asks questions rather than gives answers.
So from that, let's go to the third scene when Socrates actually is, by this point, an older man.
That was the year in which, 416 BC, the playwright Agathon won a prize for a tragedy that he put on in Athens. And he throws a party. And everybody gets drunk, and then the following night he's throwing another party, and they decide that they'd better stop drinking, and instead they will talk about love. And Socrates turns up late, and apparently he's particularly well dressed, unusually, instead of his usual rags. He's got nice shoes and nice clothes, and he's washed himself. Nobody says why. I've, again, speculatively put that together with this being the moment at which his new wife and mistress, Xanthippe, has arrived on the scene. So there's this young woman, perhaps.
So he's making an effort.
Yes, so she's telling him, if you're going to Agathon's party, you'd better dress yourself nicely and have a bath. Yeah. Anyway, that's purely speculation, but it's about that time that he must have met Xanthippe.
So we have this gathering. Who else is there on this occasion?
So we're given a number of names, people who pass through the dialogues of Plato, such as Phaedrus, is there. In the course of the evening, all these participants, they decide not to drink. They're going to give speeches about love. And Aristophanes, the comic playwright, is in this group, and he's sitting on his couch. And eventually it comes to him. And he says, I'll tell you the story about love. He said, originally human beings weren't as we are now. We had 4 arms, 4 legs, and faces that were on either side of our body, with this big roly-poly creature. And he said, we were so, as human beings, so proud of ourselves and so strong that the gods felt that we were trying to assail their strength. And so Zeus, the chief of the gods, split human beings in 2, like a wire slicing an egg, he says, so that we now only have, 1 face and 2 arms and 2 legs. He says, but as soon as that happened, the halves were desperate to get back together again and try to graft themselves onto their other half. And then eventually they would die off, and so people were always looking for their other half and couldn't find it. And so that's what love is. We're always looking for that lost other half of what we originally were. And it's getting back to that original wholeness, says Aristotle. It's a fantastic image, clearly a comic image, an image which, incidentally, brings in the idea of Zeus, the chief of the gods.
It is. It's a wonderful comic image, as you say. But didn't Socrates have a different explanation at this point?
What I'm going to do is move away from these sort of fantasies of what love is or might be and tell you the truth about love as it was told to me by this wise woman Diotima. And he then goes on to give Diotima's discussion with him. She says to him, it's as if it's like a ladder. At the bottom rung of the ladder is physical attraction. And as you ascend the ladder, you start to realize that it's about loving those things in another person that are eternal and are transcendent, things like beauty and goodness. And eventually you realize that actually true love is loving beauty and goodness and being productive in relation to that beauty and goodness that you interact with. And that becomes a very abstract view, because to be productive in relation to beauty is not just about seeing beauty, wanting to have sex with it and producing a child, recognizing the beauty of ideas and producing more ideas, so being creative and psychologically growing in relation to beauty itself.
I think it's interesting as well that we're actually getting Socrates giving an answer, which we're so familiar with the idea of him going around the marketplace asking the questions, that here he is, it's almost turned inside out. He's actually saying, I'm going to give you an answer for once.
Well, that's a very interesting point, and of course a lot of scholarship has been expended on it. What he says is, I will tell you what the truth is according to this woman who told it to me. But does he fully endorse it as an answer? Because first of all, we know that Socrates doesn't believe that you can just tell a speech and get the answer. He says you have to only strip away falsehood through conversation, through dialectic. And that's not happening here. He's reporting essentially a speech given by this wise woman. So that's the first thing. And secondly, if that were the answer, you would expect that to be the culmination of this dialogue. But it's not by any means. There are three parts of the dialogue. There's the speeches at the beginning, then there's this speech by Diotima given to Socrates. But the longest third of the whole symposium is what happens next. So Alcibiades, the young pupil of Socrates, bursts in and he gives an incredibly long speech in which he eulogizes not love, eros, but Socrates himself, as if Socrates is somehow representative of what love is. And part of that eulogy involves him saying, Socrates didn't sleep with me, though I wanted him to. And Alcibiades is famously a beautiful young man. So this is where we get the idea of platonic love, because he wanted to cultivate my soul. The idea then is that this is somehow how love behaves. It allows you to grow psychologically, allows you to cultivate your soul. If I'm right to make the equation between Diotima and Aspasia, then what we are hearing from Socrates is that she was a huge influence on him and she gave him tools of thinking. But of course, it's unfortunate that Plato decides not to say this was Aspasia, who I met 40 years ago and was so hugely influential.
So we have this, I suppose, gathering together. Just describe the scene. What would you think it'd be like if you were there?
Yeah, so I would love to be there in person, partly because I just love to see the household and the way the couches were distributed around the room and the kind of food and drink they ate. There is something about this gathering of people and everything it represents in the life of Athens at the time. And
but this is a high point for Socrates as well, isn't it? He seems to come across through this scene as the respected philosopher in the group. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. It is a high point for him.
So I think we can leave them suspended there now.
Okay.
And that's we've cut an interesting swathe through Socrates' life, from the early influences, you might say, to this fully formed character who appears right at the end. We've got a few supplementary questions. We're going to come back to 2019 now, but we're going to let you bring one object back from this world to ours.
Right.
What would you like to bring with you?
I think what I would quite like to see is the shield of Alcibiades. Alcibiades, this young man who was Socrates' pupil, fought with Socrates in a campaign in northern Greece, in a place called Potidaea, in 432 BC. The battle itself was an indecisive and rather unfortunate one for the Athenians. What happened was they were winning at the beginning, and then the line broke up. And as part of that, we learned that Alcibiades rushed ahead and put himself in mortal danger. And this was when Socrates himself must have broken the line and rescued him single-handedly. And we're told he rescued him with his armour from the thick of battle. We're told that Alcibiades' shield was particularly flamboyant. It had an image of Eros, the god of love, on it.
Oh, wow. So we've got another character indeed. So we've got the three of them all connected together with this one object, which I think will go very nicely on one of your walls around here. Let's put it up. So that's tell us a little bit more about Socrates in Love, which is the book.
So the book, yes, the book is meant to be a good read for people who know something about Socrates, but also for people who don't. So originally, I wanted to write a book about Socrates' young life. So it was going to be called something like Young Socrates. Mm-hmm. And it was only years into that quest for the young Socrates that I felt there was a gap in his early 20s, which was the time when he must have started to form the philosophical ideas that led him eventually to go to Delphi and ask with Chaerephon, am I a clever man or not? And then be told, yes, you're the cleverest of all, you're the wisest of all. And then so on to develop his philosophy. So it was in the course of doing that the figure of Diotima and this question of how her identification might be secured by understanding the clues that Plato leaves arose.
Well, it seems to me like something of a treasure hunt across the classical world with you as the historical detective, and you've done a wonderful job really reshaping the picture of Socrates, which in a way is almost as strongly moulded as one of those busts of him that you see. It's very difficult to change these things after so long, but it's a really, really intriguing story. And we've got loads of wonderful quotes for you already. William Boyd says it's a fascinating and revelatory book, a penetrating combination of tremendous scholarship, imagination, and sympathetic understanding. So that's a resounding approval there. Thank you very much for telling us all about philosophy's first and greatest hero.
Thank you very much.
Well, that was me, Peter Moore, talking to Armand D'Angour. It's tantalising really to think of the role that Aspasia played in Socrates' intellectual development, and refreshing to have this new figure at the heart of one of the oldest of all the old stories. For the historian Tom Holland, he's written of Socrates in Love as a book that succeeds brilliantly in achieving something I'd always assumed was impossible, providing a historically grounded portrait of the man Socrates may actually have been. And Baroness Helena Kennedy calls the book an exhilarating piece of scholarship. Write the name of Aspasia on your hearts. I hope you enjoyed the 6th episode of Travels Through Time. If you have any comments on our conversation, feel free to write, and feel free also to suggest possible time travellers for future episodes if you have any in mind. But from me, and for now, that's it. I'll be back with more in a fortnight.
I'm Paul Lay, the editor of History Today. On our website, you'll find articles written by experts relating to Armand D'Angour's travels. You can read Robin Waterfield on Socrates' trial, Melissa Lane on Socrates' view of democracy, while Paul Cartledge travels to the prison in which Socrates was held captive. Links to all of these pieces can be found at historytoday.com/travels. And there are many more articles on every aspect of the past in our monthly publication, History Today, the world's leading serious history magazine.